And welcome to the Presbyterian Hunger Program and Food Justice Fellows webinar. Today we are talking about Bioregional Food Covenant and Watershed Discipleship. Welcome, I'm glad you could join us. Before I pass it to Vicki, who didn't get properly introduced last time, I wanted to tell you about Vicki Machado. She's a Food Justice Fellow since May 2012. She's recently graduated with a master's from the University of Florida, where she studied religion and nature. And she is currently in Fort Lauderdale. She just got hired on as the Florida organizer for Food and Water Watch. And her work focuses on the campaign to label GMOs. In her spare time, she is organizing this year's Eco Stewards program, which is set to take place in Gainesville just next month. So, passing it along to Vicki. Thanks for my session today.
Thanks, Andrew. So I am going to be introducing the speakers for the Watershed Discipleship and Bioregional Food Covenant webinar. And today we have Ched Myers, who is an activist, theologian, who has worked in social change movements for almost 40 years. With a degree in New Testament studies, he is a popular educator who animates scripture and issues of faith-based peace and justice. He has authored many articles and more than a half a dozen books. Most of his publications can be found at www.chedmyers.org. Ched has worked with a variety of social justice organizations, including the American Friends Service Committee and the Pacific Concerns Resource Center. He is a co-founder of several collaborative projects, including the Word and World School, the Sabbath Economics Collaborative, the Center and Library for Bible and Social Justice, and recently the Watershed Discipleship Alliance. He and his partner, Elaine Enns, a restorative justice practitioner, live in the Ventura River watershed in Southern California and co-direct Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries. And for the second half of our webinar, we have Todd Winward. He lives in a yurt with his family in the high desert mountains near Taos, New Mexico. He has been engaged in experiential education and social change movements for 20 years. Todd is the founder of a wilderness-based public school, leads backpacking and river trips for adult seekers, and is the animating force behind Tilt, an emerging discipleship community in Taos.
Good morning.
His blog, Undomesticated, focuses upon watershed discipleship, wilderness spirituality, and he is the author of Secrets of Leaven, a novel Pathos.com calls a delicious mystery exploring deep questions. And they both convened in Albuquerque, New Mexico just last week for the Watershed Discipleship Conference entitled Replacing Ourselves, Becoming Watershed Discipleship Communities. So for this webinar, I will hand it over to Ched, and then we'll have, after he talks for about 10 to 15 minutes, we'll have a Q&A session for 5 minutes, and then Todd will speak, and then we'll have another Q&A session. So, on to you, Ched.
Thank you, Vicki. I am going to pull up a PowerPoint, and we'll get going. I appreciate the opportunity to be on this webinar with you, Andrew, and Jessica, working the magic behind the scenes. And I was just with Todd in the high desert on Saturday up at Lama, visiting with him, so I hope soon you'll be able to see his visage.
Muted.
We've been working together along with Vicki for the last year or so on issues of watershed literacy and watershed practice.
Unmuted.
And so I want to give a very brief overview of what we might call the logic of watershed discipleship. I want to acknowledge that today is the beginning of Passover, the great Jewish feast of liberation. And we would do well to keep in mind that Passover commemorates Israel, the Hebrews led by their prophet Moses, in their struggle with Pharaoh, a struggle to journey from slavery into freedom. It's also worth noting that in this struggle, as you remember from the book of Exodus, nature was the chief ally of the oppressed. In the Exodus narrative, it's almost as if the 10 great plagues represent the earth's insurrection against empire. And perhaps we can explain this because of the fact that in ancient Egypt, as in our contemporary society still, empire was and is at war with nature. In the 4.5 millennia since the Exodus narrative, that continuing war by empire on the earth has brought us to an end game of the interlocking ecological crises of climate destruction, species extinction, and peak everything. We won't dwell on this because I'm sure participants in these webinars are well versed in these in the ecological crisis, but this is one way to summarize our situation. James Spate, of course, is long-time mainstream environmental policy leader who in 2008 published what is really still one of the most straightforward accounts of where we are right now in terms of the crisis. How serious is the threat to the environment? He says, as you can see here, this is one measure of the problem. All we have to do to destroy the planet's climate and biota and leave a ruined world for our children and their children is to simply keep doing exactly what we are doing now. That's a very sobering reminder of where we are historically. In light of that end game, as Derek Jensen calls it, we need to talk about practical responses, not to dwell on apocalyptic scenarios, but to be passionate about how we change what we are doing right now. The most constructive public discourse for a citizenry trying to awake to this historical crisis, to be responsible in the face of this ultimatum, is the growing transition movement, which is best defined as a grassroots network of local communities that are working to build ecological resilience in response to peak oil, climate destruction, and economic instability. So transition is an approach that staves off paralysis and despair by, as Arthur Ashe famously put it, starting where one is, using the skills and resources one has, and doing what one can. And that's what we certainly want to focus on, and the Presbyterian Hunger Program focuses on in its work. But the question is, where do we start? How about right here? Now, Wendell Berry, as most of you probably know, is the foremost Christian prophet, I suppose we could say, of displacement as the great pathology of our society. And he, as he puts it here, that he wrote this some 25 years ago, the real challenge facing us is not how to save the planet, but how to care for each of the millions of human and natural neighborhoods, each of which is in some way the same and in other ways different than all the others. Wendell Berry's challenge to us to be stewards of the local, to be people who are replaced in actual lived environments, is the key to what we want to stress this afternoon. The best sort of broad brush notion or phrase for this sort of consciousness is the growing movement of bioregionalism. Been going on now for almost 50 years. It's a body of thought and related practice that has evolved in response to the challenge of reconnecting socially just human cultures in a sustainable manner to the ecosystem scale in which they are irrevocably embedded. So it's a project of re-inhabitation, where we human beings learn to live within our ecosystems sustainably rather than on top of them exploitively. So this is a movement that's been going on for a while. It's perhaps the best thumbnail definition of bioregionalism is found in Kirkpatrick Sale's book, The Bioregional Vision. Bio is from the Greek word for form of life, region from the Latin regere, territory to be ruled. Together they convey a life territory, a place defined by its life forms, its topography, and its biota, rather than by human dictates. A region, in other words, governed by nature, not legislature. And if the concept initially strikes us as strange, may perhaps only be a measure of how distant we have become from the wisdom it conveys. So we want to talk about the context of thinking socially and politically and ecologically and economically about bioregions, about the actual terrain in which we all dwell. Now, most recently, many bioregionalists, including myself, have emphasized an even more specific locus for re-inhabitory engagement. And that focuses on what is most basic to life, water. John Wesley Powell was the first non-native person to raft down the Colorado River back in the 1860s, 150 years ago. And during that journey, he really became a pioneer of the definition of a watershed, which he defined as that area of land, a bounded hydrologic system within which all living things are inextricably linked by their common water course, and where, as humans settled, simple logic demanded that they become part of the community. Simple logic, but very consequential logic, which for the most part our society has ignored for the last 150 years. The truth is, however, Powell was right. Every single one of us, wherever we reside, in a city, a suburb, or rural area, live lives which are deeply entwined in this bounded hydrologic system. Think of a basin. Precipitation hits the ridges and either flows into our watershed or into a neighboring one, drained by a water course and its tributaries, even if they are buried under concrete. The area covered in the water's journey from its origination in the natural hydrologic cycle to its end point in a particular body of water, such as a pond, lake, or ocean, that is the definition of a watershed. And every watershed is a unique mix of habitats that influence each other, including forests, wetlands, fields, meadows, rivers, lakes, farms, town. Every single one of us live in a watershed, whether we know it or not. Brock Dolman is a permaculturist, founder of Occidental Art and Ecology Center in Northern California, and he argues that watersheds underlie all human endeavors and form the foundation for all future aspirations and survival. That's a big claim. It's a claim I believe. In light of our historic ecological crisis, we are going to have to begin re-inhabiting our watersheds and figuring out how to heal them and make them sustainable. He cradles his hands, does Brock Dolman, and he talks about a notion he describes as the basin of relations. In our watershed, every living organism is interconnected and interdependent on the health of the whole. This form of social, local, and intentional community between human beings, their built environment, and all other life forms, and even inanimate processes like the fire or hydrologic cycle, that is the theater in which we need to do our regenerative work if we are to save life on this planet. And we desperately need to make up for lost time. So he talks about the basin of relations, or the watershed, truly as our lifeboat. How we imagine the world matters. This is a watershed map of the United States. As you can see, a different map than a political map with its abstract straight lines, alienated from the actual topography on which we live. This is a recent attempt to do a watershed states of America, how different our political life would be if we were truly guided in our governing by nature, not legislature. But of course, that's not the world that we live in, and so we need to begin reimagining how we do our work. Shown on screen here is the county in which we live and work in Southern California, Ventura County. As you can see, the political boundaries, as is typical of every state, most counties in the country, is straight lines that don't really have anything to do with the topography. Now, overlaid on this map, I've just put the boundary lines of the watershed that we live in, the Ventura River watershed. It's a scarce 225 square miles. But as you can see, there are no straight lines in this watershed. It's one that follows the ridge lines and the way the water flows. All of this is to say that watershed consciousness, we believe, needs to be key to our environmental, economic, social, and political consciousness in a world under sentence of death by climate destruction and the other aspects of the environmental crisis that we face. So in our work, we are proposing, in our work with churches, we're proposing the rubric Watershed Discipleship as the central concern of our time. It's this framing idea, which we're working with and which is resonating around the country, is an intentional triple entendre. First, it acknowledges the fact that all of us live in a watershed. It's our discipleship, our way of being church, our incarnational following of Jesus inescapably takes place somewhere in some watershed or watersheds. And so that's trying to be conscious about that. Secondly, it acknowledges that we are truly in a watershed historical moment of crisis, which demands that environmental and social justice and sustainability must be integral to everything we do as Christians and as citizen inhabitants of specific places. And thirdly, as Todd Winward, from whom you'll hear in a minute, likes to point out, the notion of watershed discipleship suggests that we need to learn to be disciples not only in our watersheds, but of our watersheds. In the New Testament, discipleship is a journey of learning and following and coming to trust the rabbi, which in our case now is the book of creation. So the challenge here, to paraphrase the Senegalese environmentalist Baba Diome, is that we simply will not save places that we don't love, and we cannot love places that we don't know, and we don't know places that we haven't learned. So to conclude, from the beginning of human history, nothing was more crucial to the survival and flourishing of human societies than watershed literacy, indeed a symbiotic relationship with the actual terrain in which we live. That is still the case today, but we have a long way to go to reconstruct the kind of knowledge and affection that will animate struggles to save actual real places. So we are in this transitional moment as church, and the project of trying to figure out how to be a transition church really needs to be foremost, in our opinion, on our agenda. If you want to learn more about Watershed Discipleship, you can go to the website that we've put up called watersheddiscipleship.org. And we're delighted to have this opportunity to be in conversation with the Presbyterian Hunger Program folk to talk further about these ideas. Bottom line is, we've got to reconstruct life through a bioregional paradigm. And that is the spiritual and social discipline of Watershed discipleship. Now, of course, this is a political task, it's a social, it's an economic task, it's an ecclesial task, a liturgical and symbolic task. What I want to do now is close my remarks and get ready to hand it over to Todd Winward, who's going to take us from the notion of watershed, essentially a creation-centered, nature-based paradigm, to the notion of food shed, which is one of the issues to deal with within the watershed paradigm. A food shed, of course, is in human terms, it's the area from whence our food comes. And Todd is going to talk about localizing our food shed and our food habits as practices that are most basic to human and social life within this watershed discipleship paradigm. But Vicki, let me go ahead and stop there and throw it back to you.
Thank you. I just wanted to open it up for questions. I think, Jessica, if you want to type your questions in, or if you want to raise your hand somehow, Jessica will be able to address your questions.
It doesn't look like there are questions right now. But if we want to give folks a few seconds to see if anyone chimes in, or if you'd like, we can just move to Todd and take all of the questions at the end.
Sounds good. Unmuted. Sounds good.
There is one question that came in. Raphael, perhaps we can unmute him. If he has a mic. Second. Okay. Raphael, you want to ask your question? Go ahead. Raphael?
Oh, he says he doesn't have a mic.
Oh, okay. All right. So the question is, why is it important to know where food comes from? Is that a shot?
I think I'll leave that to Todd because that's really the essence of his presentation. So, Raphael, thank you for setting us up perfectly.
Very nice.
We have one more that came in from Heidi Gamble. She asked, what do you suggest for our church buildings in light of a watershed orientation?
Great question, Heidi. Thank you. We actually spent last weekend in Albuquerque, New Mexico, talking with a particular congregation about all aspects of how congregational life can and should be transformed in light of watershed discipleship. And not least is the importance of what to do with both the brick and mortar of a church building and also the church grounds. And there are just so many possibilities, not only to green the building, make it more sustainable and eco-friendly, from water catchment to energy use to the very architecture of the building itself, making the building more of a conversation with the watershed in which it stands. But also the church grounds, re-landscaping the grounds to reflect more native flora of the watershed, bringing native plants not only into the church's landscape but also into the sanctuary as a conversation and educational piece, maybe tithing a percentage of the church parking lot to be taken up and turned into a community garden, a demonstration site for natural building or permaculture. There are just so many ways in which the physical plant of our church buildings can be demonstration projects for transition. Right now that's not the case for most of our church buildings, but it can be, and that's the challenge for the future. So I'll throw it back to Vicki or Andrew and let Todd say his piece on food.
Sorry, okay, I was on mute myself. We have one more question that came in from Weldon Nestle, and his question is to you, Ted. How might the vision of being disciples in and of Watershed relate to the adage to be in but not of the world?
Well, thanks, Weldon, and greetings up there in Seattle. You know, that's an interesting theological point, which one of the people we're working with is writing on right now, and that is the unfortunate conflation in the New Testament between the Greek term cosmos, or world, with our notion of earth. In fact, in the New Testament, cosmos, or world, is really more of a political and spiritual concept. We live in a world that is under the domination of the principalities and powers, and yet God loves this world. In some ways, I think cosmos is more a concept of what we would call built environment, human culture and society, including our political systems. Earth, on the other hand, tends to be a word in the Bible that is talked about in very concrete terms, in terms of soil, in terms of terrain like rivers and mountains, the Sea of Galilee. And it's, unfortunately, in Christian theology, we tend to think that earth and world are the same. So when Jesus says we are to be in the world but not of the world, we think that has something to do with the earth. Actually, Jesus is talking about being in society but not of society. But Jesus is always on the earth, beginning with his baptism of being deeply immersed in the sacred and storied River Jordan, to going deep into the wilderness to do his apprenticeship, something we talk about during Lent, being up on a mountain. Those are all ways in which Jesus himself and his disciples are placed in the earth, on the ground, as it were. So that's an unfortunate conflation of earth and world in Christian theology, and it's one of the many, many reasons why our tradition has done such a poor job of reconstructing a truly biblical earth theology. So I think, to answer your question, Weldon, we need to become practiced at understanding the difference between the world that human beings have made and the earth that God has made. We need to be stewards of both. Watershed Discipleship tries to give priority to creation over the re-engineered world of human society, because our re-engineered world has proven itself to be unsustainable. All right, let's throw it over to Todd.
Actually, let's have a question, and then we'll go to Todd. We've got a question that relates pretty specifically to what you were just speaking of, Chad. It's from David Grace, and he asks, how can we educate in and on the church grounds, using it as a demonstration site for Christian education and environmental education?
And David, thank you, David. I think the answer to that question is we need to rethink every single aspect of how we are church in our practices, how we worship, where we worship, the words we use, the symbols we use. One of our friends here locally who runs a faith-based organic farming internship program is on a campaign with the Episcopal Church to localize the say, we use these sacred elements of bread and wine or tapestries or candles. Do we know where these material things come from? Do we know who makes them? These are ways to replace ourselves by being mindful of the material life of the church. What are things made out of? Were they made sustainably? Were they made by people who are being paid justly? Paying attention to the things that are literally right in front of us in church, the things we sit on, stand in front of, how the walls are, the roof. That's even before we get to the question of whether our building is energy efficient or ecologically appropriate. Replacing the symbols of our liturgy, the theological imagination, our spirituality, the way we read the Bible, practicing more of an ecological hermeneutic or interpretation of Scripture. All of these things, all of the ways in which we are church are relevant to these questions. How we use the church kitchen. Is it only used for church potlucks, or could it also be used for canning workshops and fermenting workshops and teaching young people the old arts of home economics? Again, our church lawns. Do we need lawns, or should we be having native plant gardens? Can we have less asphalt and concrete and more earth right in our church grounds? That's where our churches can become exemplary vanguards of a transition movement. So that's my hope, that congregations will embrace the practices of Watershed discipleship.
Great. And we've got a couple more questions, but I think they'll fit well in the next Q&A session. So now you have Todd Windward calling us from near Taos, New Mexico. Go ahead, Todd.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Well, good afternoon to most of you. Thank you for attending. Chad, thanks for your good words. I'm experiencing some technical difficulties here. I'm doing my best to come back in, so thank you very much for your patience there, Andrew. I'd like to start with what you just asked, David, about how the church can be practitioners. What does it look like for the church on the ground? I've been inspired by Chad's words and worked with him as a colleague for a couple of years now, and really wanting to ask the question, what does Watershed discipleship look like in daily life for church as body as well as for ourselves? In this Watershed moment history, it's clear that our watersheds are asking us to repent to the good old-fashioned altar call of turning around our lifestyles. How do we shape ourselves to fit our finite planet is the question that David Orr asked so well. There's a quote that has moved me a lot by David Orr. It makes far better sense to reshape ourselves to fit a finite planet than to attempt to reshape the planet to fit our infinite wants. So as church, what does it take to reshape ourselves to a niche, to our own place? Andrew, just checking, am I on fine? Andrew?
Yes, hi, sorry. I'm back.
Good, I just wanted to double check my audio is doing fine?
Yeah, it sounds fine.
Okay, thank you. And so this idea of, as Chet was speaking of the human-made world, the re-engineered world, and the created world, and how can we become creatures of our creation has been for me to think of my watershed as rabbi, to think of Watershed as sustainer, teacher, and corrector. So a few years ago, I began to ask the question, can all of my food needs be provided by my watershed? Why is that important? I began to ask that question and to realize just how displaced I was as a practitioner, as someone who dared to call himself a follower of Jesus. What was I doing to my earth as I was truly much more involved in the American dream than in the dream of God? Most of humanity for all of history have been sustained by their watersheds. It's only in recent moments that we haven't. So can the items my family loves be sourced in my bioregion? It becomes ridiculous when I think about northern New Mexico. And the Italian Parmesan I like eating, and the Florida orange juice I like drinking, olive oil imported from Italy, things like that. So as an American consumer steeped in values of global economics, the suggestion of being fed by my watershed seems first absurd and scandalous. I'm trained to buy whatever I want, whenever I want, without a second thought. So this redesigning of what it means to be an ambassador or embodier of Christ's message in today's world makes me think about adapting to my watershed in new ways. My watershed corrects my spoiled behavior, just like in any master-apprentice relationship. It's a kind of a conversion, a metanoia. His earliest followers, as we know, were taught to walk away from self-advancing values of empire. These same age-old precepts central to the teachings of Jesus are equally central to the teachings of my watershed. They cause me to look anew at two questions. What can my watershed provide, and how can I adapt my wants? Up here in northern New Mexico, we began to ranch with yaks, sheep, and goats, and we found that yaks were not sustainable after 5 years. They were more trouble per pound than what goats could provide. Goats, we found milk, cheese, kefir, yogurt, meat, but yaks were harder to reach and harvest. I began to make a list of the items that I could harvest from my watershed, and I came up after 5 years of thinking that, there is a humble, practical, yet visionary covenant I could make with my watershed. And this is something I'm suggesting to all of us. Here's a promise to make. By the year 2025, I will source 75% of my food from within 100 miles. I'll just try that on again. By the year 2025, I will source 75% of my food from within 100 miles. If we can do that in northern New Mexico, it can be done in most places in America due to the sparseness of our climate. Can this vow make a big difference? I believe it could. Some people need to know, well, why is this important? Let me go to that question that was asked earlier. Well, first of all, it enriches local economies. Thousands of families committing local for the long term establishes new demand in new markets. It creates an incubator for regional businesses. It provides good food to people within the community. Right now, there's so few local growers and so little food available because America doesn't demand it. We don't ask for that yet. It corrects our crazy consumption. Sourcing food locally means adapting to our watershed and learning to live within the limits of enoughness. The people of Exodus, as we know, were confronted with learning enoughness, and that's an ancient wisdom teaching for us. Thirdly, it improves individual health. When communities encourage one another to eat food produced out of the land, better health is likely to develop. And finally, less petroleum, packaging, and pollution. Currently, mega-chain food travels more than 1,000 miles to reach our store. And so I'm envisioning a covenant that is taken on individually but also collectively, and that question of what can church be? What if church could be community-supported everything? What if church could be envisioning community organizations committed to healthy local food for all, so not just an elite, greenwashed kind of eating for just the wealthy? How can we become community organizations that provide local healthy food for all? It would create, as Brock Dolman writes, as what Chet has mentioned, basins of relations across race and class. Everyone on the planet lives in basins of relations with one another in their watersheds. It would create new and affordable connections between folks of different race and class. Once we get to know and eat from our bioregion, we care much more about the health of the individual bioregion, the quality and soil of air around us. And lastly, it improves community resilience. If and when bioregional sources thrive, we no longer are dependent upon external inputs of energy, external inputs of food, etc. So if and when regionalism happens where we need to feed and require, we'll be ready for that. Just a few things, what it might look like, some promises that we see right now. Food hubs are a big deal in America today. There's 188 of them recognized by the USDA. And food hubs are places that are much bigger than just a CSA or a farmer's market. Right now, less than 1% of our food sales in the U.S. come from farmers' markets. The food hubs are the next horizon in which distribution becomes a major key of collective farmers getting together to move their food to local people. On the growing and retailing side, there's been lots of growth like that. Farmers markets and CSAs and food hubs providing local products in big chain stores. So the retail end is beginning to sell and pay attention to this movement. However, for those of us about consumers, what about us on the consumer side? We're still too often looking for best quality, biggest variety, lowest price. As displaced people, we're addicted to this idea and not caring where it came from or what season it is, that I should have my tomatoes anytime or my oranges anytime. And so there's a few ideas of eating seasonally and eating locally that I've seen that move it far beyond the individual consumer. The one I'd like to highlight the most right now is the La Cosecha farm in Albuquerque in the South Valley. As Chet mentioned, we were working together, Chet and I and many others this weekend, imagining how churches could become watershed discipleship communities. And the farm featured there is La Cosecha Farm with the agricultura movement. And what La Cosecha does is provide, like most CSAs, weekly boxes of fresh, beautiful, locally grown food. But their vision goes far beyond, and is to make sure that locally grown organic food is accessible and affordable for all members of the community. Churches, imagine churches being the place, the economic, prophetic voice that demands local, healthy, affordable food for all. The Agricultura Network, working with La Cosecha, has taken 2 steps further than most CSAs. First, they work with government agencies that low-income families can pay with stamps. They can actually pay at a CSA. And secondly, they're committed to subsidizing CSA shares